thank you so much for inviting me to moderate this conversation with Dr. Bitzer, and thanks for everyone for joining. I do have a question for you, Savannah, and for Meg and Mindy and your colleagues in the development office. When you scheduled this, did you schedule it knowing that the first presidential debate was going to be last night, or was this just pure coincidence?
Yes, we actually had no idea. It was pure coincidence. It happened to be a date that was convenient for us and Dr. Bitzer and yourself. So it just worked out perfectly.
Well, while the debate was a bit unusual, we're going to try to do our best to stick to the discussion that you outlined earlier and not be distracted by last night's theatrics, because we do want to have a focused and rational discussion. So let me I have the great pleasure of introducing our star for today's discussion, Dr. Michael Bitzer. I really think most of you already know Michael. So let me just tell you a little bit about him, just very briefly. Michael joined Catawba in 2002 and is a professor of politics and history. He currently holds the TP and JC Leonard Chair of Political Science. Dr. Bitzer teaches a number of courses in the field of American politics, public administration, policy, and the law. He has also taught the college's honor program, including the course States of Killing, Genocide in the 20th Century. Along with his teaching responsibilities, Michael also serves, as most of you locally know, as a frequent political analyst for several media sources, locally, regionally, and nationally. And just on a personal note, let me say, as a daily subscriber to the New York Times, I cannot tell you how exhilarating it is for me as a proud Catawba alumni to pick up the New York Times in the morning and to see Michael frequently quoted in articles about American politics, not only related to North Carolina, but also nationally. Michael is also the author of a blog, Old North-South Politics, which I urge you all to check out. Of course, that just scratches the surface, but now, without any further ado, let's hear from the expert. Michael, the floor is yours.
Dan, thank you so much, and it's great to see you, and thanks to everyone for joining us. What I want to do is kind of talk about, as Savannah mentioned, the way that political scientists think about campaigns, think about elections. You know, there's a lot of coverage, there's a lot of talking heads out there, but the way that political scientists think about politics and think about campaigns and elections is kind of unique, but I think it could ground a lot of folks in some basic information. So what I'm going to do is share a very brief PowerPoint session just to give folks a sense of things that we're looking at. And hopefully we are sharing now. So of course it is 2020. And if anybody had told me what we would have expected over these now nearly 9 months, I thought, or would have thought, that you were pulling my leg, but it is 2020. And so we are in the midst of a major campaign. We've got an election coming up in a little over 30 days. And so I think it's good to just start off by thinking about the general scope of American politics. And, you know, for a lot of folks, when they tune in, if they get engaged, if they are viewing or watching or listening about American politics, I sometimes think that maybe folks may feel a little bit like this. Particularly in our modern times with mass communications, quick communications, you know, things in American politics can ratchet up fairly quickly. And so, you know, if you're feeling this way, boy, this kind of escalated very fast, you're not alone in that regard. And then if you're also somebody who likes to watch the news, particularly political news, I'm sure you probably turn on the TV, maybe to your local news station or maybe one of the major news networks, and you start to listen to some of the political news, and maybe you're like, there are some days that I feel like that. You know, it's time for the crazy pill dosage to come out. For those of us who are average political scientists who study both American politics and have to watch the news to literally keep up hour by hour, what I tend to see and tend to have a reaction to is something along this line. I'm asking that question a lot nowadays, to be quite candid with you. What was that, and how do we put this into context for understanding American politics, and particularly for understanding this campaign and election? And so I draw back on my experience, my understanding, my readings in what we as political scientists call election fundamentals. And I want to go briefly through these. I talk about these in my campaigns and elections class this fall. And I think that this helps to ground a lot of just basic information about what's going on in the campaign and give us an orientation to how things may play out come November 3rd. The first and foremost thing that I always talk about with the students is you can pay attention to national polls, you can look at national dynamics, but the fundamental is that it's all about the states, and it's all about 270, and it's 270 electoral votes. That's the rule of the game when it comes to the game of American politics and presidential campaigns. It's all about what's going on in the states, and it's all about the accumulation towards 270 electoral votes. It's great to watch the national horse race dynamics, but it's not about the national dynamics. It's about the states. And so when you hear states of battleground status, like Pennsylvania, like Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, perhaps some new battleground states like Arizona, Georgia. Could Texas be included in that? Ohio is a traditional one. Those are the things that we as political scientists who study American politics and campaigns and elections are really intensely focused on. The second key fundamental is really the status of the candidates themselves. And what I mean by status is it an incumbent-based election or is it an open seat election? Those are really two different kind of elections. 2016 was an open seat election. This year, it's an incumbent-based election. And generally what we as political scientists know about incumbent-based elections is that they will generally be referendums on the incumbent itself. Voters generally tend to look back in time and say, does this current incumbent president deserve another term in office? Typically, if it's an open seat election, if there is no incumbent running for re-election, that means the voters look ahead into the future prospectively and say, who do we want to be governing our country moving forward? Now, you can have a combination. Voters can take different approaches with this, but generally it's my sense of this year's election that it is definitely a referendum on the incumbent President Donald Trump. Another key fundamental is presidential approval and disapproval. How is the president doing in terms of his, maybe one day her, job performance? What we know is that typically presidential approval ratings tend to indicate when presidents who are running for re-election are in trouble, or they may have a coast and a safe ride towards election or re-election. Another key fundamental is indeed the economic dynamics of what the country is going through. And typically, this tends to be in the summer months leading into the fall. Yes, we elect in November, but a lot of voters tend to make up their minds or look or get engaged over the summer. And so typically things like unemployment rates may give us a clue, but generally the research has shown more importantly than the unemployment rate is the gross domestic product, the GDP of the country. That tends to set the general economic parameters for how voters are going to particularly evaluate an incumbent president. Moving beyond economics, it's oftentimes when you ask voters, is the country on the right track or the wrong track? That also tends to give us data and information about the mood of the voter. If the voter believes that the nation is on the right track, that's generally favorable to the party in power. If the country, however, feels that it's on the wrong track, that tends to indicate that the voters want a change in leadership. And that can be a particularly important piece to understanding what happens in November. The last two dynamics I think are really important to understanding our current environment. And one is the partisan dynamics. Tip O'Neill, a famous speaker of the US House of Representatives in the 1970s and the 1980s, had a key phrase that he always uttered. He always said that politics is local. All politics is local. Well, in today's environment, 40 years later, we as political scientists tend to look at that and say, with all due respect to the former speaker, it's now the fact that all politics is national, meaning that we have nationalized our politics to where how an individual votes at the top of the ballot works its way straight down the ballot oftentimes. And particularly for races like state legislative races, maybe even down to some mayoral elections, what the reaction is to the top of the ticket, the president, can have an influence even at the local level. So that's something that we are seeing more and more of, a real nationalization of our politics. And then finally, it's all about turnout. Who shows up? How engaged are voters? And what are the turnout dynamics that particularly play towards different states, different communities, and how the voters are engaged and introduced to the political system. Now, I want to focus quickly on the partisan dynamics, because when it comes to political scientists, if you tell us which political party you identify or perhaps lean towards, we, in terms of our research, know that that will drive so much of your voter choice. And I want to give you two recent elections. This is data collected by the American National Election Studies. And what they do is they ask a series of questions to engaged voters in an election. And the first question that they ask is, how do you identify politically? Are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Or are you an independent? And for folks who identify as a partisan, they will ask what is called the strength of their partisanship. Are you a strong Democrat? Are you a strong Republican? Or do you feel maybe not so strong as those die-hard individuals, not strong or sometimes referred to as weak Democrats? If a respondent identifies as an independent, they will also ask a second question and ask, well, do you lean to one party over the other? And these are what are called the partisan leaners in our electorate. If a respondent says, nope, I don't lean to either party, that's the pure independent. And you'll notice at the bottom of this chart, strong Democrats, 22%, all the way over to strong Republicans, 17%. That's the percentage of the electorate that was in 2012 that identified based on that party identification and strength of party identification. Notice right in the middle, 9%, meaning that 90% of the electorate identifies in some way, shape, or form with one of the two major parties. Now, a subsequent question gets asked after the election: how did you vote? What was your vote choice for president? And among the strong partisans, what we find is indeed strong party loyalty. 98% or 97% of strong Democrats or strong Republicans said they voted for their party's presidential candidate. Not surprising, but that is the strength of those individuals and their vote choices. When you start to work your way towards the middle, the not strong partisans, well, there's a little bit of slippage in 2012 between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney when it comes to those folks who identify as not very strong. It slips into the 80s. And notice that amongst not strong Democrats, 16% of them defected and voted for Romney, whereas amongst not strong Republicans, 12% split or defected and voted for Obama. This is a very natural pattern that we generally tend to see. Now, the question becomes, what happens with these independent leaners, these independent Democrats and these independent Republicans? Are they weaker partisans when it comes to their vote choice? Or do we see as strong, between 80 to 90% voting for their party? This has been a consistent pattern over time, and the independent leaners generally are as partisan, if not more partisan, than those who identify as weak or not strong partisans. 88% of independent Democrats voted for Obama. 86% of independent Republicans voted for Mitt Romney. It's only when you get into the pure independents that they tend to split very nicely and are the competitive areas. But notice the green bar as well. That's other parties, third parties. From the wings towards the middle, you'll notice that there's a slight pyramid moving up in terms of third parties. That's 2012. Let's look at 2016, our most recent presidential election. The strong partisans, once again, 95 to 97% voting for their party. The weak partisans or not strong partisans, 3/4 of them voted for their party's candidate. The independent leaners, one to the Democrats, one to the Republicans, actually stronger than the weak partisans. It's when you get into the independents that the substantial, a good number, 23% voted third party. And so the likelihood is that third party effect that generally tends to be a spoiler effect in American politics benefited Donald Trump, who got 44% of the independents to Hillary Clinton's 34%. So that just kind of tells you from a political scientist point of view what the perspective of, if you tell me your partisan indications, I'll pretty much know 3/4 of the time you're going to vote for your party that you lean to or identify. So just so that you know, over the next month, maybe extending past November 3rd, most political scientists are going to be looking at this data and is likely to face the next month or months this way. If only I could fall asleep early. For everybody else in America, my first and foremost stress point for this presentation, please go vote. We need your voice to be heard and to be engaged in our civic responsibility. Then, after you vote, whether you vote by mail, vote in person, vote early, vote on election day, after you voted, here's a slight recommendation that I would encourage you to consider. Relax. We're going to get through this. It's going to seem tumultuous. It is, but we're going to get through it. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan for any questions and potential answers that I could provide.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. And to all of you on the call, let me just say, my friends and fellow trustees, Deborah Messenger and Darlene Ball and I have the great pleasure and honor this semester of auditing a class Michael's teaching called U.S. Campaigns and Elections. And what you just saw was just a smidgen of the great content that Michael presents twice a week. In fact, we have a class this afternoon from 2 to 3:15. The class is spellbounding. And, you know, I learned at the foot of the great teacher, Sandy Silverberg, and Sandy was incredible. Michael is equally as incredible. And I'm just so proud that Catawba has someone like Michael.
That means a great deal. Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the elephant in the middle of the room.
Sure.
Tell us what you thought about last night.
So, you know, as a political scientist, I go into presidential debates knowing history. I have a master's in history. I've got a PhD in political science. And I've studied American history, and I understand, and I have watched presidential debates for many years. And we always have an expectation of, well, candidates want to achieve certain things, whether it's policy initiatives, whether it's making differentiations from themselves and their opposition. There's some goals that they want to achieve. Last night, you could tell very early on that was a debate like absolutely no other debate. In my mind, it was not so much a debate. It was a planned strategy by President Trump to come in and continue to knock down what we in political science call the norms of American politics. There are written rules to the game of politics. And if anybody has taken my class, they know that I look at things through the game theory lens. You know, it's a game of politics, and it's about power. How do you get power? How do you keep it? How do you expand it? And what I saw play out was pure, unadulterated power dynamics that break the unwritten rules of the game. Generally, presidential debates, there's acknowledgement of the other side, there's introductions, there's questioning. Yeah, there's going to be barbing and going back and forth. But the intentional interruptions designed to throw former Vice President Biden off, that was a deliberative strategy in the game. And when you got to the point of an hour and 15 minutes into the debate, when Chris Wallace, the moderator, who had to remind the president not once, not twice, not 3 times, but an hour and 15 minutes into an hour and a half debate, remind him again, these were the rules that your campaign agreed to. It said to me, this was deliberate. This was intentional, and he was knocking down the norms, the unwritten rules of presidential debates, just as he has done with a lot of other aspects in American politics.
Thank you, Michael. So a brief follow-up. I want to move on
Yep.
to other questions, and we have a bunch of questions in the chat, which I will get to. The follow-up question I have is, in your view, why did he decide to deploy that strategy, use that strategy?
I think for him and for his campaign, honestly, I think 2016 was a surprise. It stunned him that he won. And with the belief of inevitability that he can resurrect and utilize the same strategy in 2016, and maybe even not just double down, but triple down on that strategy. It's what we would call a base strategy, that there are, as I indicated, loyal Republican voters. And that if he can generate enough enthusiasm and energy, he can get them to show up. He could maybe pull off the Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan straight that he had to pull in 2016. The problem is the base of the Republican Party has been shrinking. And while they are intensely loyal, any defections or any enthusiasm or engagement by the opposition, the Democrats, makes that strategy even more doubtful. So I think, from his perspective, he was playing to his strengths. He's a TV reality actor, player. That's how he portrays it. And I just think that that fit into his backstory as a strategy, and that's how he prepared, and he did prepare, and that's how he executed.
Thank you very much. We have two questions, and I'll try to wrap into one.
Mm-hmm.
One goes to the question about access to early voting, mail-in voting, and what impact you think that's going to have on the outcome of the election in terms of turnout. And a related question is to what, if anything, is going on campus to encourage students to make sure that they're registered and that they're voting.
Yeah, those are great questions. Let me, in fact, take the second one first here. I have been sending out emails, not just to the students, but to the faculty and to the staff, the general campus community, about the changes in North Carolina's absentee by mail voting. It is very much a different vote method that a lot of people are not used to here in North Carolina. But because of COVID-19 and the concerns about public health issues, North Carolina currently, as of this morning, has over 1.1 million voters having requested an absentee by mail ballot. If you go back to 4 years ago, this same day, we are 10 times ahead of where we were this time 4 years ago. And the total number of absentee by mail ballots in North Carolina submitted in 2016 was only 200,000. So right now we are over 5 times the total number in this state. And we've already exceeded 2016's total numbers of return ballots at 280,000. 280,000 North Carolinians have already voted before last night's presidential debate. So what we're seeing nationwide is almost 2 million registered voters having voted already. And that is a huge dynamic that is fundamentally reshaping and scrambling things up to where we as political scientists are going, what's going on here? I really don't understand. But the issue of voter integrity and ballot security is also a fundamental concern as well. And I think, the president has made the argument that there are unsolicited absentee by mail ballots and solicited absentee by mail ballots. Let me be very clear. From the research that I and other political scientists have done in terms of electoral fraud, there is zero capability of 80 million ballots just floating out there and being able to influence the election, because every ballot has a unique identifier, and every county board of elections can track that unique identifier. And if ballots start coming in that don't have that unique identifier, they don't get counted. So I am well aware of electoral fraud in this state. You don't have to remind me in 2018 and 2019 about the North Carolina 9th Congressional District. I was in the middle of that mess. But we have enough, and by we, I mean the electoral administrators in all 50 states are well aware of the security issues and concerns, and people should know voting by mail is a safe alternative if you want to do that.
Thank you. And then the second part of that question about what's going on campus.
So on campus, I've sent out emails kind of talking about things. We are very concerned about the spread of COVID here on campus. And so we are trying to do voter registration, encourage people to register online and to also request their ballots online. Fortunately, we have been very safe in terms of the number of cases that we have here on campus, unlike a lot of other institutions that made it through 1 week of the fall semester and had to go remote. I'm teaching all of my classes in person. I have a mask on, all of the students have a mask on, but we are encouraging people to utilize the remote capability of registering to vote, requesting your absentee by mail ballot, and then either returning it by mail, or if they feel like they need to, they can take their absentee by mail ballot and hand deliver it to the County Board of Elections or to an early voting site.
Great, thank you,
Sure.
Michael. Does the number of early voting, the amount of ballots requested, et cetera, does that tell you anything about how those people are voting? And I know it's different state by state,
Yeah.
but are those votes counted in advance, or does the counting actually have to wait until election day?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question, because what we've actually got is one election that's administered by 50 different rules. Here in North Carolina, if you request your absentee by mail ballot and you return it and it is accepted, it will be processed, meaning that they will go ahead and scan the ballot. They cannot tabulate your ballot. They have to wait until the polls close on election day in order to release the counts of the votes. In some states, like Pennsylvania, they cannot process the ballots until election day. And so some states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, it may take several days in order for the full number of ballots that have been properly submitted to be counted. So I would encourage people in some states, when you watch the returns on election evening, recognize not all the ballots have been counted. They are legally submitted, but there may be a delay in terms of those counts. North Carolina is fairly unique in that when the polls close and the first numbers come out, those are the early votes, by mail and in-person absentee voting. I've heard predictions from the State Board of Elections Executive Director, 80% of North Carolina's ballots may be cast before Election Day. Wow. That's a huge shift in terms of the dynamics here in this state.
Well, your reference to the North Carolina State Board of Election leads me directly into a question that was just submitted. Apparently, and I'm not familiar with this because I don't live in North Carolina, there were some recent resignations of some Republican members from the board. Could
Right.
you speak to that?
Yeah, it has to do again with absentee by mail voting procedures. Here in North Carolina, it was originally established that if your ballot was postmarked by 5 o'clock on Tuesday, November 3rd, Election Day, you would have 3 days for that ballot to be returned to the county board in order for it to be counted. What they have since done is extend that 3 days to 9 days, recognizing that there may be issues with the U.S. Postal Service. This was in response to a lawsuit that was challenging how they could go about making sure that everybody who was trying to vote had a legal opportunity to cast their ballot. What happened was they made an agreement between the parties. The general counsel for the State Board of Elections explained all aspects to the 5 members of the State Board of Elections. All 5 voted to accept the agreement. And then after a call from the North Carolina Republican Party's general counsel, the 2 Republicans versus the 3 Democrats on the State Board of Elections announced their resignation and gave reasons for it, even though subsequently those reasons had been addressed by the State Board of Elections general counsel. So we are in the midst of a deeply divided, polarized state, mirroring what is going on nationally, I'm afraid.
So one more question for now about North Carolina. Do you see a shift in the demographics of North Carolina, reflecting in the voting patterns between rural and more metropolitan areas?
Yeah, and I want to pick up on a comment that I just made. North Carolina, in my opinion, is becoming a microcosm of our national politics. What is happening and the dynamics nationally is playing out day by day here in North Carolina. And what we're seeing in terms of the urban-rural divide is very much that partisan-driven dynamic. In central cities like Charlotte, Raleigh, Asheville, Fayetteville, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Durham, those areas went 2-1 for Hillary Clinton in 2016. In the rural counties of North Carolina, they went 60-40 for Donald Trump. So it's almost, parallel universes that we are operating in between the central cities and rural communities of North Carolina. The battleground, as it is nationally, is in the suburbs. But in North Carolina, there are 2 distinct suburbs. There's the urban suburbs within an urban county, but outside the central city, and then the surrounding suburban counties. Among the surrounding suburban counties, Donald Trump won 2-1, 65-35 in 2016. In those urban suburbs, Hillary Clinton won 49-48. So within one area, you've got this kind of dynamic, and in everything else, you've got this dynamic or this dynamic going on. And the other aspect of North Carolina politics, and particularly voters, is a generational dynamic. Voters under the age of 40 make up 36% of all the voters in North Carolina. And they have a very different political affiliation. In fact, something we're going to talk about in class today, Dan, versus particularly boomers over the age of 55. So this, the way that I describe North Carolina is we're dealing with tectonic plates that are rubbing up against each other. And at some point, there's going to be an earthquake. And there's going to be a pretty significant shift of the state from center right to center left.
And I know North Carolina is among states. There are a number of states that are sort of in that position: Arizona and potentially Texas and
Yes.
maybe Georgia and
Yep.
others. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
We have a question from an alum who's a Florida resident, but
I know that alum.
I want to expand the question a bit and make it a more national question. You know, in all likelihood, there will be lawsuits and recounts associated with this election. And there's a scenario where there could be a case in front of the Supreme Court with either 8 or 9 justices sitting on the Supreme Court. There's another scenario where the election, the presidential election, could end up in front of the House of Representatives. It's virtually impossible to game theory out all the various scenarios. But could you walk us through in the few minutes we have remaining, sort of 2 or 3 or 4 scenarios that you think could be the most likely without getting too complicated and
Sure.
too much in the weeds?
Sure. The way that I'm thinking about November 3rd and post is kind of in a couple of discrete ways. First is the national dynamics, and particularly the state returns, are so overwhelmingly for one candidate over the other that the margins of victories are expanded at such a level that there is no doubt about who won. That, in my mind, is probably the cleanest and least controversial approach that we could envision happening come November 3rd and afterwards.
Are you talking nationally or in certain states?
In certain states, the battlegrounds: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Ohio, Iowa, those kind of classic battleground states. That's one scenario. The second scenario is that every one of those battleground states has a margin of victory of 1 to 2%. And there's where you get into the controversies that could play out into other scenarios. If we end up in that latter scenario, 2000 will look like a cakewalk compared to what we will see in a variety of states, all leading up to potential legal challenges and working its way up to this Supreme Court. In 2000, I was a graduate student working on my PhD at the University of Georgia. That election went into December. There are certain deadlines that have to be met in order for things to be ready by January 20th, when a new term for whoever is elected president begins. And right now it's all hypotheticals, but a lot of us are looking very closely and very intensely at what some of those dynamics could be, because I would hazard a guess it could be a real possibility we get into legal challenges and start to go down paths we've never been down before, unless you go back to 1876, and so forth, beyond what our modern history has told us.
That last point you made, though, I think is really important, because I just recently finished biography on Grant, and there was discussion of some of the 1860s elections. And, I don't remember the specific election, but, elections have ended up in the House of Representatives before. Not that I'm hoping that happens this time, but I think it's important to look at what we're going through in this country today through that historic lens and in that historic context, and not get ourselves so twisted up and anxious that we get overly excited about this. Because we can drive ourselves to the brink of exhaustion.
Very much so, very much so. And I think and studying not just political science, but American history. And I'll end on this note. I do believe that we are in an inflection point in our history, that American history, for those who have had the pleasure of having Dr. Gary Fries, he talks about his pendulum approaches. I have a similar dynamic, but perhaps a little bit different from the way he looks at it. But I think we are at this inflection point dynamic, that we are facing a fundamental shift in our country, generationally, particularly, that when those events happen, there's a lot of angst, and there's a lot of concern, and there's a lot of resentment, and there's a lot of anger, but we manage to get through it. And I think in the way that I'm trying to process all of this, I have to keep reminding myself, this is history playing itself out, and we all have a voice and a role in that history if we choose to participate and to express it. So again, my hope is, no matter which side you are on, exercise your fundamental freedom and right to participate in our grand American experiment of self-governance. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dan. I also want to say thank you to all the alumni who have been supporting the college, particularly the trustees, during this very tumultuous time of COVID. The faculty, and I'll speak for myself, are very appreciative of all the support that alumni have given to the college.
And I want to thank I see Dr. Nelson, President Nelson's on the call. I want to thank the administration and the faculty for your leadership, and the staff, the leadership you provided. I'm just thrilled that we are one of the leaders in terms of our response to COVID, which you referenced earlier, Michael. It really is astounding, and I'm just thrilled. So, we have some more questions, but the note you ended on, I think, is an appropriate way to end this conversation, unless there's anyone on the call who has a burning question that they want to ask. I don't know if, Savannah, if you want to take people off mute, if anybody wants to jump into the conversation, I'm happy for that to happen. But I really think the historic context that you ended on, Michael, is really something we need to tuck away and think about. Before this call, I was looking on the college website, and I reread the college mission statement. And there's a word in there that really goes to what you were talking about, Michael, and that word is character. And, I think we need to think about, in the coming days and month, sort of who we are as a nation and our character as a nation. And it really goes to your admonition to all of us to vote, and your call to action, because that really will let our individual character and our collective character come through and render itself in the character of our nation. So I want to thank Savannah and Meg and the Development Office for pulling this together. I want to thank all the alumni for participating, and mostly, Michael, I want to thank you for everything you do every day.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you all.
And I'll see you at 2 o'clock.
See you at 2 o'clock.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Yes.
And remember to
thank
vote.
you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Bitzer and Dan Bross. You guys are phenomenal. You do a very good job of keeping us informed. And I, as well, have been learning a lot, just keeping up with the articles that Dr. Bitzer has been in. So thank you for all of your help and for doing this with us today. We really appreciate you. And our alumni are very appreciative to get to see you and hear you talk about these kinds of things in such a prominent time. So thank you all. We do have some more upcoming events in the near future. We've got a talk with Tiffany Cox, who is a theater alum, and Amy Strand, who is also a theater alum. And those will be coming up in October 7th and October 14th. And we will also be hosting an alumni panel discussion for class of 2020. We want to get the student or now alum involved and in conversations about what it really means to be an alum. So we've got the perfect school and the amazing alumni to go along with that conversation. So thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at more events in the future. And we will go ahead and let Dr. Bitzer and Dan Bross get prepared for class today.
Thank
Good
you.
to see everybody. Thank you.
Bye.